Okay, so it gives me great pleasure to introduce John Karachewski, who's one of our illustrious honorary members, as well as a longtime member of NCGS. He held this program director's role for many, many years, did a great job, and is filling in, as I noted before, on short notice tonight, so we appreciate that. He's conducted geology and environmental projects throughout the Western US, from Colorado to Alaska, to Midway Island and throughout California. He's also taught evening geology classes and GIS classes at Diablo Valley College. He's led numerous non-technical field trips for the public throughout the Bay Area. In fact, he was helping today with the Cal Academy setting up for something that's going to happen over Memorial Day weekend, right?
Yes.
So he's also led trips for the Field Institute up at Point Reyes National Seashore and other organizations. Doris Sloan, one of our other illustrious members, is online with us tonight, and John collaborated in a popular book about the geology of the San Francisco Bay region. It's a Bible for many of us. I take it with me whenever I hike in the area because there's so much good information there. John has volunteered for many positions in NCGS, and most notably as the program chairman. So in 2022, he received the NCGS Honorary Member Award for his contributions to the society. So we thank you again. Tonight, he's going to speak to us about California hydroscapes. So John, with that, I'm going to get out of the way and sit down.
Great. Thanks, Jim. It's a real pleasure for me to be here tonight. I really enjoy giving these kinds of talks. These are this is a geologic travelogue, and we're just going to look at a lot of beautiful slides and give you some stories behind them. And you've probably been to many of these places. They're throughout the state. But what I hope to do is also give you some stories behind this, what's the first shows up in the landscape. There are many stories. There's usually 3 or 4 of them right off the bat that I put in these photo essays. So there's going to be a lot of fun geo trivia. My numbers may not always be right, so if I do say something glaringly wrong, please don't hesitate to let me know about that. So we'll go ahead and get started. And I chose this slide, first of all, because I'm going to take a quiz or a test. Has anybody hiked to this locality in Yosemite National Park?
No, I haven't been there yet.
Okay. Okay, that's perfect. This is actually one of my favorite photos of Yosemite, and yet I've never seen it on a calendar, on a coffee table book, or a soda machine in Yosemite Valley. So how is it possible that hundreds of millions of people have visited Yosemite over the last century, and I've never seen this photo, and no one can tell me where I took this? Actually, Ed Folsom told me where to take this photo. Ed Folsom was an engineering manager at Lawrence Livermore. I was taking some of the colleagues for a hike up Clouds Rest. And he said, oh yeah, when you're on the Clouds Rest Trail and you hit the Sunset Lakes Trail, go around the corner, there's a little knob, and you're looking right down Tenaya Canyon. And if Ed hadn't told me that in the hallway, I'd have never seen this photo. So it's perfect. I've accomplished my goal right now because I've shown you a photo of Yosemite you've never seen before. In my view, this is actually one of the most striking U-shaped photographs of the valley that you've never seen. I think this is a more dramatic glacial erosion shot than from the typical tunnel shot. So that's kind of the photography part of it and how I wound up there. But the fascinating story is, if we go back to the last ice age when Tuolumne Meadows looked like the Juneau ice field, there was one glacier or a finger of a glacier that didn't want to behave properly. And it actually flowed uphill over a bedrock ridge out of the Tuolumne watershed and flowed down Tenaya Canyon, which we're looking at here, Half Dome is on the left, and the Merced Glacier joined with the Tenaya Glacier before proceeding down Yosemite Valley. So these are the kind of stories that just are fascinating. The public likes them. And again, it's the story behind the scenery. It's a fall shot, so you could see the yellow colors. Tenaya Canyon is so rugged that there's no trails in Tenaya Canyon, although I'm sure that Bill McSee has hiked and climbed in there from Lawrence Livermore. And the lighting isn't great, but it's actually turned out to be really nice because it's very soft and it highlights a lot of the features. Unfortunately, I hung around there for too long and I had to really hustle to get back to the car. And my headlamp died before I got to the car and it was pitch dark. Fortunately, there was another couple who was even later than I was, and I followed their headlamp out to the car. But after this trip, I went out and bought a really good headlamp. Okay, so the Groundwater Resources Association has been around for about 30 years. It's a group. Bill Motzer here has been president. David Abbott, he's not here tonight. He's been treasurer since the beginning. And it's a group of geologists, engineers, regulators, consultants, industry, and they've worked a lot. It's a very applied group to work on challenging groundwater issues in California. And they publish a quarterly newsletter. And in 2009, I was thinking, you know what, some magazines have like a nice photo at the back page. And so I volunteered. I said, why don't you let me write you a photo essay at the back of the issue? And so I guess I'm up to 50 or 60 photo essays. I'm not going to show you all of those tonight, but that's where that evolved in 2009. And so this is a subset of those photos. And every quarter comes around actually pretty quick. It's like, I thought I just sent one in and now I got to figure out what I'm going to research and write for the next one. So I wound up having to, in Google Earth, just put a red dot so I could figure out where I've been and which photos I've used. And I've had to start keeping track of those so I don't use the same one over again. And so you see that there's reasonable coverage around the state. But there's a lot of gaps. So I need to take a lot more trips in retirement out to the Mojave Desert. I haven't done any hiking or backpacking in the Klamath Mountains. There's a lot of wildlife refuges in the Central Valley. So I use this not only to tell me where I've been, but more importantly, where I need to go for my next camping, hiking, and photography trip. Things have evolved through time so that for most photos, I will now include GPS coordinates. And often I will include the date and the year that I took the photo so that in the future, if somebody wanted to go back and see how the environment has changed, they could get pretty close to where I took that photo. So that's some of the ways that things have evolved over time. And so, can we hide that menu bar that tells the geographic location?
We can move it.
Okay, if we can move it to the top would be better, or getting rid of it.
Can you go first?
No, there's some problem with the way this is projected. I'm afraid if I go full screen, I'll lose the controls and things here.
That's fine, perfect.
There you go.
Thank you, Jim.
You bet.
So, two things on the logistics. When you see the spring 2009, that's the issue. That's not the time that I took the photo. So this was actually my first and best groundwater slide. And so when you think about it, it's really hard to get a good photograph of groundwater because one, it's underground, and two, it's pretty dark down there. So that's some geologic humor there, but in reality, that's true. So this is MacArthur Burney Falls. This is north, about an hour north of Lassen. And this was really my first groundwater shot. And so MacArthur Burney Falls flows 100 million gallons of water per day. It doesn't matter if it's a drought. It doesn't matter if it's a wet year. It doesn't matter if it's summer. It doesn't matter if it's winter. It's 100 million gallons per day. And that's because it doesn't care about what the weather is or what that winter or summer was like. Its recharge is a large area of northeastern California. So it's a regional aquifer. And so seasonal effects are just very minor blips on the flow in Burney Creek. The other thing, I haven't hiked upstream of this fall, but if you hike a short distance upstream, there will be zero water in the creek. I mean, this spring, there'll be a lot of water, but so there's no water as you go upstream of this waterfall. So you've got 100 million gallons coming out of groundwater springs. And then it's like a TV commercial, but wait, if you look right down in the middle, and unfortunately this mouse isn't going to really work really well, but halfway up the photo, if you look, there's a secondary set of springs coming out of the tuff layer. And that secondary set of springs flows at 1.2 million gallons per day. So this was literally the first. And so this will work, but not for the folks at home. And that's all right. Can't quite turn it on. But anyway, that's the secondary set of springs. So this was the first and best groundwater shots. I said, well, it's going to be hard to write a quarterly photo essay unless I broaden my horizons. And so we've expanded to geology, environmental issues, and pull in groundwater wherever we could. So in the 90s, I used to work for an environmental consulting company. We did a lot of work on cleanup of Navy bases in Southern California. This is Point Mugu. Highway 1 is down there in the kind of the center. And I like this shot because it's evening, coastal fog is coming in, the light's pretty soft. And so you don't realize that that's actually the Point Mugu Naval Air Warfare Center. It's a very large facility, lots of buildings, runways. President Reagan used to probably fly into Point Mugu, but that's kind of blotted out by the evening haze. It's the largest coastal wetland in Southern California. And so it's the largest wetland because it happens to be protected on a military base. As a sedimentologist, I like this photo because you could see the high wave energy. The Navy guys and the contractors like their own private surfing beach. You have an estuary, so all kinds of seals and birds. You have the contrast of the high wave energy shoreline, the tidal lagoon, tidal channels, mud flats. So the contrast between high and low energy is right there. But the story that you don't see is hidden where the entrance to the lagoon is. There's actually a very large submarine canyon just offshore, Mugu Canyon, a very large submarine canyon. And so the coastal plain is underlain by both marine and fluvial deposits that interfinger, and they're exposed in the walls of the submarine canyon. So under natural conditions before development of this area, groundwater flowed from the land, the right towards the ocean, and it discharged in the walls of the submarine canyon. That's the natural system. But over the last century, there's been a lot of agricultural development. You have some fairly large cities like Port Hueneme, Oxnard. And so with groundwater pumping, this area has now been plagued by saltwater intrusion. It's not just this area, any coastal area worldwide has probably got a saltwater intrusion issue. LA, Oxnard Plain, Monterey Bay. In fact, the saltwater wedge comes almost 6 miles inland to Highway 101 and Salinas. So the pumping drops the water table below sea level, and the gradient is reversed now so that you have saline water flowing into the aquifers. There's lots of wells that aren't properly sealed, and so you contaminate and affect water quality in multiple aquifers. Okay, Trona Pinnacles. I was just there about 2.5 weeks ago and had to stake the tent down with hundreds of pounds of rocks so it wouldn't fly away. This is a really cool story. You've probably seen these Tufa Towers in many movies, Star Wars and commercials. There were Martians driving Toyotas during the Super Bowl here at Trona Tufa Towers about 3 or 4 years ago. But the reason this is such a fascinating story is if you're a really lucky snowflake during the last ice age and you fell just east of Tioga Pass in Yosemite National Park, you get compressed into the glacier that flows down Levine Canyon. You calve off as an iceberg into Lake Russell, which is now Mono Lake. And then when Mono Lake fills up, you flow down the Owens River Valley, down to Owens Lake by Lone Pine, so you could see the reflection of Mount Whitney at sunrise. And when Owens Lake fills up, then you spill over into China Lake, which is the sister base for Point Mugu. When China Lake fills up, it flows into Searles Lake here. And when Searles Lake fills up, it spills over into Panamint Lake. And when Panamint Lake fills up, it spills over into Lake Manly and Death Valley. So what we have here is during a pluvial period, the water was as deep as 640 feet deep. We have a fracture system, so we're perpendicular, not parallel to the shoreline like a bathtub. We're perpendicular to the shoreline. Calcium-rich groundwater is coming up along the fracture, mixing with the carbonate in the lake. Each lake gets saltier down the chain. And with the help of cyanobacteria, you grow these tufa towers. And the massive ones versus the smaller pinnacles probably reflect different glacial stages, like in the classical terminology, the Tahoe and the Tioga. So that's the story of Hollywood loves this place. It's only 3 or 4 hours from Hollywood. So again, you've seen it if you may not have realized it, but there's a groundwater reason for why these tufa towers are there. Sorry, I'm having a real problem with this mouse. This mouse and I don't get along. I'm sorry, Jim. I'm having okay. All right. Staircase Falls in Yosemite. How many folks have seen Staircase Falls? It's right above Curry Village. Okay, a few hands go up. It's literally right in back of Curry Village, but 90% of the year you're not going to see it because it's a very small watershed just west of Glacier Point. And so you need to be there like mid-May in a really good snow year. And what you'll see is that the waterfall follows the jointing in the Cretaceous granitic rocks. I couldn't quite zoom in with my eyes on the geologic map. I think it's half dome granodiorite, but I'm not positive of that. So most years by June, it's gone. Small, low elevation watershed, but it'll be flowing this May. Why did I choose mid-May? Because I wanted to teach my son about the hydrologic cycle, and I was going to get him super soaked hiking up the Mist Trail and horizontal spray coming off Yosemite Falls. So he didn't turn out to be a geologist, but he learned about the hydrologic cycle. All right, Bumpus Hill. This is at Lassen Volcanic Park. This is at sunset. there was a full moon coming up, so I purposefully wanted to go there at sunset to get this shot. I did need a headlamp though, because it took a while for the moon to make it up over the horizon, but there was nobody there, so I had Bumpus Health to myself. It's the most active and dynamic hydrothermal system in the Cascade Range. Fumaroles, boiling springs, boiling mud pots, steaming ground. And the interesting part of this story is that those thermal features will exhibit different characteristics in different temperatures. So with our thick snowpack this year, this spring and summer, the geothermal systems are going to be at a slightly lower temperature, and the boiling mud pots are going to be a lot more fluid. If you're in a drought year or later in the year when things start drying out, then the shallow water, groundwater system is less important and things are hotter and drier. So that's an interesting part of that story. This is 49 palms in Joshua Tree with the charred fan palms. These are native fan palms. And oftentimes here in Joshua Tree, as well as there's a great hike I did last November and just outside of Palm Springs, Palm Desert, Palm Canyon. A lot of these riparian palm oases are found along fault zones, or you could see them like couple hundred feet above the valley floor there at Agua Caliente Reservation. There's just a line of palm trees on the side of a hill. And they're only there because of the groundwater coming up the fracture. And there may be different permeability on either side of the block, and the groundwater comes up. So that's the benefit of the water being low down in the valley. Of course, flash floods are very rare, but when they happen, that can kill or basically, to kill and destroy a lot of the trees and vegetation. If you've ever driven down, I think it's Highway 152 from like Gilroy, Hollister over Pacheco Pass down towards Los Baños, you pass San Luis Reservoir, and you'd be hard pressed to name any creek that has much water flowing eastward off of Pacheco Pass. And that's because there isn't any. This is actually a completely artificial lake, and it's uphill of two canals. It's uphill of the federal Delta Mendota Canal, and it's uphill of the state California aqueduct. So during wet years, they actually pump water uphill from the aqueducts into San Luis Reservoir. This year, and the year I took this photo, it's pretty full. It's 9 miles north-south and 5 miles east-west. But I've also driven by there when there's less than 10% water in there. So it's not a creek flowing into the reservoir, it's actually water pumped off hill. So it's the largest off-stream storage probably in the US. And it was built in the construction started in the early 1960s. President John F. Kennedy actually flew in and as part of, the initial construction and dedication to get the project going. Okay, so we jump around geographically, and this is just the order that I published these in. If I wasn't so lazy, I would have arranged them geographically, but this is strictly the random order that I published these in. So I'm going to take you to a few days before Christmas, 1955 and 1964. Very thick early winter snowpack in Northern California, followed by pineapple expresses. And you have what are rain on snow events and catastrophic flooding throughout Northern California. And normally, I don't like boring blue sky days unless I actually can't get another shot. And I don't normally include minivans as scale in these photos. but both of the minivan is really important because for scale. So if you look, we have 3 railroad trusses. The 2 on the left are more shiny and they look newer. And the one barely visible on the right is rusty. The one on the right is rusty and it's about 70 feet above the Eel River. There were tree stumps from that flash flood a few days. Well, the extraordinary floods right before Christmas 1964. The water here wiped out the 2 left trusses and deposited timber. A lot of timbering up here. This is in Humboldt Redwood State Park. And if you drive up the Avenue of the Giants and you read the signs, you can see like telephone poles. And if you look at the top of the telephone pole, it'll show you where the water level was in December 1964. If you drive Highway 101, you drive through the lumber town of Scotia. And in that flood in 1964, the discharge beneath the highway was 750,000 cubic feet per second. I don't know what that means. So if you make a basketball as being roughly 1 cubic foot, just for exaggeration, there's 750,000 basketballs passing underneath the roadway every second. That was probably larger than the Mississippi and all the rivers in the US combined. They got 22 inches of rain in 2 days on top of a thick snowpack. And pretty much every bridge and road and Highway 101, if you were there at the time, many towns, small lumber towns were destroyed, never to be rebuilt, including the one here at Dyerville.
John, I went through there a couple of years back with that on a motorcycle. I could look out into the valley. I saw the telephone poles that you were talking about. Looked out in the valley and there were 2-story houses upside down, sitting on their roofs out in the fields.
Hey.
Where they had floated and then got dropped like erratics, wherever they landed.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Okay, Carrizo Plains, if you're looking for someplace to go in the next few weeks during the week, I'd head down to Carrizo Plains. The wildflowers are probably going to start looking really good. And I say the weekday because I was there during the week and it was a storm, beautiful clouds, fantastic photography. Saturday, thousands of cars came up from LA. All the roads are dirt. So if you look at it, there's very little sky here because it went from super clear to just dusty and hazy on Saturday. So that's why I kept the sky out. But this is Wallace Creek, named for Robert Wallace at the USGS. Very famous. And what you're looking at is I'm standing on the North American plate. You can see the San Andreas Fault going from lower left to upper right. It takes a jog. These numbers are going to be just approximations because it was easier for me to remember. But the first jog is about 400 feet and a little less than 4,000 years. If you look just to the right of the 2 power lines on the right center, there's another beheaded channel. That was where I'm standing about 10,000 years ago. And in 1857, one of the 3 great earthquakes in California history, the 1857 Fort Tejon earthquake, the San Andreas moved about 33 feet here at the Carrizo Plains. So since the sky wasn't good, I kept just enough in there that you could see it, but not much more. Okay, Mono Lake. The peak in this the mouse and I aren't getting along, but roughly the peak to the left of the center is Mount Dana in the edge of Yosemite National Park. in the mid-90s, there was a very brief time for just a few years where there was a retired wildlife biologist from Alaska who had a permit to run boat trips on Mono Lake. And so I did that with my family, and I led one field trip for Pal Extension. And I always like to finish off the last stop of the day with a really special trip. And so I took the class up to the top of Negate Island here. But the only way you can get here is on a pretty treacherous and tricky kayak trip because the winds and waves kick up pretty high on Mono Lake. So 1941, the city of LA, Department of Water and Power, started diverting water all the way up here. And they didn't take water out of Mono Lake because Mono Lake was already saltier than seawater. What they did is they diverted the streams flowing into Mono Lake. So when you drive out of Yosemite, you can see there's a lot of reservoirs and flumes. That's the fresh water that doesn't make it to Mono Lake. So since 1941, start of World War II, it's not a huge amount of water, and we'll talk about acre feet in a little bit, but LA only diverted about 15,000 acre feet of water. So that's roughly an acre foot is a football field with a foot of water. And depending on the family, a suburban family you might get 2 to 4 families, depending on how green their lawn is, for an acre foot of water. So we're talking about water for maybe, 25, 30,000 families. So given the population of LA, it's not a lot of water, but the lake levels dropped dramatically. The salinity doubled to almost, it doubled. And then their water decreased. So you were not, and these islands, these volcanic islands with eruptions in the last 500 years, they're important bird nesting colonies. And so not only are you affecting the ecosystem, but you're also impacting with things like coyotes and things that now start coming onto the islands. So it was an ecosystem literally on the verge of collapse. It's a very low diversity, but high population. So you've got flies, brine shrimp, and birds. So not a big diversity, but in huge numbers. And so you've probably seen bumper stickers, Save Mono Lake. I think there were a bunch of students at UC Davis, and they kept pressuring the State Water Resources Control Board. And in 1994, the State Water Board modified LA's permit. So the amount of water fresh water they could divert depended on the lake level. And if it was a drought year, you're not going to get any water. And if it's really good, then you can divert. So there's limits based on lake levels trying to stabilize the system. So that's yes.
Before you leave this slide, if you look across the lake on the left hand, where those buildings and trees are, that's Levining.
That is correct.
And Highway 395 goes along basically the lake shore to the right. And in the right-hand side of the slide, where the mountains come down almost to the lake, that's where the big slides have been in the last month. And you saw in the paper where the road was buried like in 45 feet of snow, right there in the right-hand side of that slide.
Thanks, Don. So yes, that was one of the stories I was going to mention. And since you mentioned Levining, my eyes aren't good enough, but there's actually, you can see horizontal lake levels above the town of Levining, and that shows you the levels of Lake Russell. Russell was the USGS geologist in the late 1800s who wrote first professional papers on the geology of this area. So yeah, Highway 395, which is the major route, LA to Reno, has been shut since the late February. And I think they were just reopening it to escorted trips this week. So it was literally shut down for a month.
Those Cuba things in the foreground there, no.
No, the yellow are the flowers growing on the volcanic rocks on Negate Island. So you'll never get this photo unless you kayak out there. And yeah, so this is very unusual. So the Tufa Towers of Mono Lake were exposed because of the water diversions to LA. But the same processes that are operating at Mono Lake also operated at Cyril's Lake. And the difference is at Mono Lake, the Tufa Towers are parallel to the shoreline like bathtub rings, whereas at Cyril's Lake, they're linear in one part of the lake only along a fracture system. Okay, in the foothills near the town of Jackson, we're in the Paleozoic Calaveras complex, marbles and metamorphosed carbonates. There's over 1,100 mortar holes here. You see the big valley oak in the background. And the only reason this photograph works is because it happened to be a freak rainstorm in September. And it highlights the rock and it shows where the mortar holes are filled up and you have a few fall leaves. If it wasn't for that rain that came in that evening, this would have never have been a photo. So those are kind of, sometimes you got to get lucky. Okay, how many people have seen the title columns walking to the Giants Stadium?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is actually geology and art. It really is science, and it's intended to educate the public about the dynamic nature of the tides. And each of those thick color bands is a foot. So if you look at this, we have 2.5 feet on the thick black bands. So the tide, when I took this photo, was 2.5 feet above mean low water. And so it's a pretty cool display. It just kind of looks like art, but if you stop and read the plaques, it's actually intended to, and it changes as the tides come in and out to show the dynamic nature of it.
And the difference between the yellow and the back plant is.
I think the yellow, maybe the yellow one, I'm not quite sure. I don't remember all of the details. It may be below, when you have a low tide, like below zero, is my guess, because there's only 2, 3 of them. So that's my guess. I generally don't try to avoid politics. I certainly avoid politics at home. But one of the things that really is striking, like when I would talk to Doris, is in the 1960s, you would never be taking a walk along San Francisco Bay. There's maybe a couple of miles of the Bay Trail, and now there's 300 or 400 miles. And the 1960s, the environmental degradation was extreme. If you, Doris, you could smell the bay before you could ever see it if you were a kid. Just landfills, burning garbage. I grew up in Chicago. The sky in Northwest Indiana with the steel mills wasn't blue, it was yellow. My mom would say, roll up the windows and don't breathe the air. The Cuyahoga River in Cleveland caught fire multiple times. You couldn't see the mountains, the San Gabriel Mountains in LA from Pasadena because of the smog. And so the environmental degradation was extreme. And so on a lot of trips, I like to tell people, who created the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency? It was Republican President Richard Nixon, who signed off on the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act. This was all done under the Nixon administration. Almost unthinkable today in our polarized politics, yet that was what he needed to do to try to get voters in California. And so what we faced at that time, so just think of the progress that we've made in 50 years where you didn't want to go to the Bay 50 years ago, and now there's bike trails and hike trails, and the most valuable property is along the waterfront. And so one of the problems we have with CO2 is you can't see it, you can't taste it, you can't touch it, you can't smell it. Whereas in the 1960s, the degradation was so extreme that it forced all of these major changes.
Dixon also gave us 55-mile-an-hour speed limit.
You know,
Probably did more to drop carbon emissions than any other legislation in the US.
so I think I was too young to drive a car, but getting close. I was a freshman in 71. All right, so I've
So I think, John, you don't want to go back to the old days.
So sometimes all the good, well, my career was based when I moved from Denver. I was started in the petroleum industry, and Amoco actually offered me a one-way ticket to Houston. And my girlfriend and wife Susie was in the Bay Area, and I told Amoco, sorry, but a one-way ticket to Houston's not going to work. So I actually tried to get a job with Chevron, but I wound up having to change careers and go environmental when I moved out here. I've led a lot of field trips out at Point Reyes, and every time you go out, you see something new and different. And so this is February 2015. And I mentioned that only because January 2015 was one of the driest months ever in San Francisco history, essentially no rain in January. And so it's like a week before the trip, and I'm walking along Palomar Beach, and I see a miniature groundwater system. And again, driest January ever, but there was a little bit of rain the week beforehand, and it gave us this ephemeral groundwater system. So we've got Santa Cruz mudstone, which is impermeable in the bedrock, with just a very thin icing of quaternary terrace and fluvial deposits. So it rains a little bit, the water soaks into the loose unconsolidated sediments. You could see the green on the right-hand side. There's some water flowing in. It's a winter beach because you can kind of see a scarp in the gravels behind the water. So the winter waves erode the beach. You're left with the gravels. The fines are flushed out into the quiet water setting. And in literally 100 feet or so from the creek or the mouth to where the water's coming out of the gravels, you have the recharge of groundwater into the gravels. It travels for minutes to maybe an hour through the gravels, and it discharges on the beach. And so this was like it's a perfect example of a groundwater system on a miniature scale. And instead of decades, centuries, and millennia, you're looking at groundwater flow from recharge to discharge in maybe minutes. Okay, this was actually an NCGS field trip, spring of 2015, to look at petroleum systems. I know Will was on that one. So we were looking at petroleum systems north of Santa Cruz. There was also a wine tasting that afternoon. And in the Santa Cruz mudstone, it's Miocene. These are roughly 7, 8, 9 million years old. You could see these carbonate vents, seeps, and structures. This is again West Cliff Drive in Santa Cruz. So you have organic rich sediments, and the fluids and gases are coming out of those layers and bubbling out onto modern day Monterey Bay. And this is what those structures look like in the rock record.
And it must have taken a lot of patience to wait for all 40 of the field trip people to not be.
You know, I can't remember. So yeah, I generally try to keep, although sometimes people, if they are cooperate and are good models and wear a red jacket, then they make for really good scales and landscape photos. All right, La Brea tar pits. My son wanted to go to Disneyland, so I said, well, this is going to cost you. We're not going to Disneyland until we go to La Brea tar pits first. And so I like this shot because you've got the tar, but if you look closely, there's a little bit of water floating on the surface where you get the reflection of the tusks. And so this is the perfect analogy for how the Ice Age megafauna, they weren't attracted to the tar, they were attracted to the water that was sitting on top of the tar. You get in there and then you can't get out. And so that then attracts other carnivores, and it's one of the best Pleistocene megafauna localities in the world. I think they've pulled out at least 5 or 6 million fossils, something like 660 species. Fun trivia fact, I think there's 3 floors of the Campanile on the Cal campus that have got La Brea tar pit fossils, because nobody really wants oily, tarry, smelly fossils in the basement of their building. So we're what better place than the Campanile to stick them in. So traditionally, the focus was on the large megafauna, but starting in around the 70s or 80s, paleontologists started looking at the rodents, at the lizards, at the insects, at the pollens, to get a better feeling for how to reconstruct the cooler and wetter climate that would have been more similar to Northern California.
I could see if I'm right, that building is the Page Museum in the background, is it not?
Yeah, so the Page Museum, one of the things these are just stories off of memory lane. So there's little preparation for these talks. It's whatever story comes out. But I had to research George Page because I figured I might get a question. So he died at 99 at the turn of the century. So he's a teenage kid, left Nebraska, and in the 1920s, it was a really big deal to get a piece of fresh orange for Christmas in your stocking. And so he came out here as a teenager, and he started selling packaged fruit to send to people back in Nebraska and the Midwest. And so he actually became quite wealthy with his gift fruit boxes. And then during and after World War II, he ventured into real estate. And to him, everything had to be packaged and look nicely. And he actually complained that when he went to the LA Museum of Natural History, that they didn't do a very good job with displaying the fossils to make them of interest to the public. So there's always the friction between the amateur and the professional, but he brought in like Hollywood types and paleontologists from Utah, and he wanted his museum to bring the fossils to life so that kids in education, they would get excited about seeing the fossils. And so that was his philosophy, and it's a wonderful museum. So if you haven't been there, I highly recommend it. Okay, snowshoeing on New Year's Day with my son. The Sierra Snowpack provides about 1/3 of the water supply for California, or about, in quote, normal years, which we don't have because it's either really high or really low. But quote, in a normal year, it provides roughly 1/3 of the water supply for California, about 15 million acre feet. All the California's water infrastructure was set up for a different climate. That's one where you get snow in the winter, you keep the reservoirs low for flood protection. And then in the spring and summer, the snow melts and refills the reservoirs to provide for agriculture and urban uses. So that's the traditional system. That traditional system is being heavily strained as the climate changes, and our extreme droughts and precipitation are a real operational challenge. Okay, Lake Tahoe sunrise. So people really like Lake Tahoe, and I like Lake Tahoe, but I don't go up there very often. And part of the story that I'm going to present is it's actually one of the most altered places in California. And what I mean by that is the Lake Tahoe that we see bears no resemblance to what Mark Twain saw in the 1860s. In the 1880s, nobody went to Lake Tahoe to recreate. It was clear-cut. It was completely clear-cut basin, except for a few large sugar pines that you'll see in a park here and there. So 1 billion with the B board feet of lumber were timbered out of the Lake Tahoe watershed that was used to supply wood for the mines of the Comstock lode in Virginia City, for building materials, for fuel. And so if you look at the historical photos, it's just clear cut. And so one of the things that you see, if you look at the Tahoe forest, it's all about the same species. The forest is all about the same age, the same type. It's really crowded. And so it's a beautiful alpine setting, but it's not the Lake Tahoe that Mark Twain saw just a decade or two after the start of the California gold rush. Second deepest lake in North America, Crater Lake is #1. And I was surprised to find out that it's the 6th largest by volume. So after the Great Lakes, Lake Tahoe is the largest lake in the US by volume. Okay, this is, so you have Yosemite Valley, and the next valley to the north is Hetch Hetchy. And I took this photo in April 2008, about a week before I went to work for DTSC, the California EPA. And it's a beautiful photo. I really like this photo, but it was a very shocking photo. So, I'll tell you why here in just a second. So you go to Yosemite Valley, and in April and May, you're going to expect to see booming waterfalls. And this year it's going to be great. There's 2 very large waterfalls in Hetch Hetchy, and they have very long Native American names that I can't remember and can't pronounce. And so when I went in there in April of 2008, I was shocked that one of the 2 waterfalls was dry. And the other one normally is flowing so hard that the trail is impassable because the river flows right across the trail. And so it was really shocking and jarring to be there in April and to have the water flows being, one of them already being dried up. So what you don't see, and it'll be hard for the people on the, I moved the cursor, but if you look right there, you could see a 100-foot bathtub ring. So Hetch Hetchy Reservoir was 100 feet lower than normal. So it's beautiful. You've got the silhouettes of the pine trees. I caught it right before the sun goes behind the ridge, so you get the flares. It's a stunning photo, but the real story is the drought of April 2008. And so that's what I really like to do in terms of going in the stories behind the scenery. Malakoff Diggings, a very historic park. So we're going to go back to the Eocene at a time when the Sierra Nevada foothills look like Costa Rica. They get 200 to 300 inches of rain a year, and the plant fossils, I've never seen them, but you could tell by the shape of the plant tips that they're elongate and they're funnel shaped. This is the ancestral Yuba River, probably started headwaters up in the Nevada Altiplano. Lots of gold. These are called the auriferous gravels. There's just one problem. The Yuba River is down in the bottom of the valley, and these auriferous gravels are 1,000, 1,500 feet at the top of the ridge. And so very shortly, within a decade after the gold rush, and you picture the Panner in 1849, it became very corporate very quickly. And so the miners built and dammed a lot of lakes in the high Sierras, and they built hundreds, if not thousands of miles of wooden flumes to bring water from like the Donner area to the Sierra foothills, where they blasted the cliffs away and created these Badlands topography in about 30 years. And so it was a real contest because The miners were the primary industry of the day. Yet if you owned an orchard in Marysville, every spring you had to worry about how many feet of sludge would wash out of the Yuba River and destroy your orchard. And so there was actually a lawsuit, and in 1884, Judge Sawyer, who came out as a miner and 49er, actually signed the first environmental law in California that the mining companies could no longer dump their tailings into the riverbed. Interestingly, hydraulic mining continued up in the Klamaths, but not in the Sierras. And I forget the exact number, but San Francisco Bay ran brown. And you roughly flushed about a minimum of 3.5 Panama canals worth of sediment into the Sacramento Valley and San Francisco Bay. They used a lot of mercury to recover the gold. So that's why when you go to any fishing pier in the North Bay, especially San Pablo Bay, and you'll see warnings about mercury consumption in fish. And that's all a legacy. And San Pablo Bay was noticeably shallowed because of the tailings that washed in. In the 1860s, there were a lot of surveys because of the booming, you needed to get ships from San Francisco to Sacramento. So there's a lot of good navigation surveying in the 1860s. So you can have a baseline of how the bathymetry of San Pablo Bay changed in the early years of the hydraulic mining and through time.
Yeah, John, the amount of sediment actually pre-hydraulic mining was the average depth of San Francisco Bay was about 40 to 60 feet, depending where you are. And the hydraulic mining lost so much sediment in that the average depth went to 20 feet.
Okay. All righty, I'm looking at my timer. I got it started late. We're at about 50 minutes. If I can take a few more minutes until I get the cane, we'll go for a few more minutes. Anza Borrego, beautiful place. They've had great flowers there the past couple of weeks from what I understand. As a photographer, I like storms. So blue skies, Doris will tell you, I tell her blue skies are nice, but they're boring. So storms add drama. This was a February President's Day weekend. You can see the green leaves coming out on the Ocotillo. But the story that I really like here is there's a wonderful tectonic story in the peninsula ranges from the Paleozoic passive margin to Mesozoic granites. But it's in the last 20 to 30 million years with the development of the San Andreas and the opening up of the Gulf of California and the new ocean basin that has just an extremely fascinating tectonic and sedimentology story. So the short version, 3 to 5 million years ago, North America and South America are still separated. You have the Imperial Sea, roughly where this probably going up to maybe even Coachella. And it just blew my mind. But there are Caribbean fossils that you would find in the Caribbean, Pliocene Caribbean fossils in Anza Borrego before you close up Central America. And so it's like it was unimaginable. There's a similar story for Iceland, but that's a different slideshow. But to think you've got Caribbean fossils in Anza Borrego, and the Salton Sea is 270 feet below sea level. So the only reason you don't have beachfront property in Coachella is because after the closure of that, the Colorado River dumped so much sediment that it basically built a sediment dam between the Gulf of California and the Salton Sea, which was dry until the levee was breached in the early 1900s. Going back to Mammoth, Rainbow Falls. There's 2 rivers in the Sierra, the Feather River and the San Joaquin, that actually start east of the Sierran crest. And so the middle fork of the San Joaquin flows from north to south. The Mammoth ski area are the pumice slopes in the top of the photo. And most people go to Devil's Postpile to see the basalt columnar joints and the glacial polish on the top. These are rhyodacite. You can see they have crude jointing, but at the base, it's more of a thinner platy jointing, more easily eroded. And so since in the Holocene, this waterfall has eroded headward by about 500 feet. And because of the low gap east of the Sierra, that allows the winter storms to not die out on the western side, but they have a low spot that they can punch through the Sierras and dump tons of snow on Mammoth. My son sent me a text today that said they had their record snowfall ever at Mammoth, and that's because of the low spot in the San Joaquin River allows the storms to punch over. And if you drive 395, you'll see there's beautiful pine forest south of Mono Lake, and that's the moisture and snow effect from the west side. We're on 25. I'm going to cut it off here. I'll do just one or two more. There's a new park called California Coastal National Monument. It was established by President Clinton, and Obama added some to it. There's 6 units. They're widely distributed from the Piedras Blancas Lighthouse by San Simeon and Hearst Castle up to Trinidad. This is a shot taken around New Year, so you could see there's a lot of good wave action. We're in Franciscan sandstones, and so you get not only lateral erosion, but a vertical shaft. The seawater is compressed, and if you've got good wave action, you get a really good looking blowhole. And we'll do 2 more and then we'll cut it off. This was the Monday after the 49ers lost in the Super Bowl and a month before the COVID shutdown. So I took a couple of friends down to Santa Barbara, and I was just struck by the clarity that Monday morning. It just, you can see the individual towers on those offshore platforms. It was just striking how clear it was. We're looking at Anacapa Island. That's a beautiful day trip on the left from the town of Port Hueneme. There's been a lot of work in the Santa Barbara Channel, collaborative work with the federal and state agencies, USGS, NOAA, Minerals Management Service, California Geological Survey, studying everything from fisheries to sediment erosion to contaminant migration. And now one of the issues that is coming up, and I just looked at a newspaper article, is there's about 23 oil platforms in the general Santa Barbara area, and 8 of them are scheduled to be decommissioned in the next decade. So a lot of these were put in the 40s and 50s. There's a lot of corrosion, and well abandonment is a tricky proposition that's also extremely costly. Many of the companies who profited from that are no longer in business or declared bankruptcy, which means that you as the taxpayer get to shell out the $1 billion to abandon those wells. And then there's controversy. Should we cut them off and leave all the organisms that have grown on the infrastructure, because now there's biologic reefs in the subsurface, or do we just take everything away? So those are kind of some of the scientific and political and economic issues that go into. It's just not a simple plug the well and chop off the platform. So it's literally going to take a decade to get decommission about a third of the platforms. What's that?
What's on the far horizon?
On the far horizon is, I used to work at Point Magoo, and the supervisor didn't like me because I was an office guy and he was an old curmudgeony old guy. That's San Nicolas Island that's owned by the Navy. And I really wanted to get out there, but he never allowed me to go out there. So I've never been to San Nicolas, but it's a Navy island.
Firing.
Yeah, right.
You don't want to go there.
Well, yeah, but if they're not firing, there's lots of elephant seals. It would have been cool to say I've gone to San Nicolas Island, but couldn't get out there. So I'll close it with this shot. I have a few more and I saved you about 30 from the collection. But you can get really nice photos out of an airplane. I like to fly to visit my mom in Chicago in the springtime. This is taken with a telephoto lens. I actually had to contact Greg Stock, who was one of our May Distinguished Lecturers, because I didn't know exactly where this was. But if you're flying from Chicago or Denver to San Francisco, and you're sitting on an F window seat, so that the lighting is good, you fly over Mono Lake, and then the plane flies the Tioga Road. And so we're looking into the Hoover Wilderness. In the upper right-hand corner are the large lateral moraines kind of heading out towards Bridgeport. I think this was 2016. This was roughly 87% of the snowpack. So not a great year, but not bad. And so what you need for a good photo out of a plane is contrast. Things that work really well are snow, rocks, and clouds. So when you get that combination, you can get a nice shot out of a United Airlines, messed up plane window. The previous year, 2015, the snowpack on April 1, which is the official number that water managers really care about. So 1 year earlier, snowpack was 5% of normal, and we were in the 4th year of a drought. So that just shows you the extremes of 5%, which is nothing to, this is going to be a really good year.
170%.
But our extremes are really expanding. And again, in terms of climate change modeling, they're talking that by 2050, the snowpack in the Sierras might shrink by 25 to 40%, and perhaps like 75% by the end of the century. So whatever our water system is set up for, regardless of what those exact numbers are going to be, the old system isn't going to work in the future. So what I love giving these kinds of slideshows. We've rambled around the state. We've rambled in stories. It started off with wanting to just write photo essays, and that kind of gives me an excuse to go hiking and biking and photographing and exploring new places in our beautiful state, and with complex and many fascinating stories behind the scenes. So thank you for coming out.
Okay, it's almost 8:30. Just a couple questions?
Just want to make a comment. John mentioned Hydrovisions. It's freely downloadable on the internet at grac.org, and you can see John's photos on the back of the Hydrovisions article.
Great, thank you.
I just wanted to mention there are two interesting hydrology stories going on right now, and that is, one is the research being done to see if they can locate the old stream beds.
Yeah.
And see if they can use those as recharge basins.
Right.
That's one story. The other one that's kind of interesting is that Polarity Lake is coming back.
I saw that, yeah.
Hell, down around Corcoran.
Yes.
Our dinner speaker this year in May is going to be a hydrologist and consultant, Rob Gailey, who's going to talk to us about the whole water systems here in California. So it'll be very interesting. Yeah. Okay, one more comment back there, or no? Okay. Yeah. John, I imagine you've probably got one of these NCGS mugs already, but I'm going to present you with another one.
Okay.
Yes, so thank you for being.
All right. Well, thank you, Jim. Thank you for inviting me.
Okay. Next month, the speaker will be actually online. His name is Larry Toy. He's a engineer who's going to talk about the Webb telescope. He was part of the crew that built that thing and is going to show us pictures and discussion of how that all went together. So be very interesting talk. All right, see you. Thank you. Bye, everybody online.
You know, people were online.
16.
16, oh,
Yeah,
more than.
yeah, we had a good turnout. Yeah,
No, the pictures are gonna be good when John talks.
exactly.
Was Francisco.
Called it.
All right.
That you're.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. Thank you.